I like to play games. And when I first started thinking about this week and this week's Torah portion, I was thinking of a game that some of you might remember that had an extraordinary run on television from 1961 to 1975. It was known as Password. Some of you might remember it. Alan Ludden was the host. He was known for the College Bowl. And the object of the game was that you would get a word that the person holding the password they would want you to figure out what the password was, and they would say a word. It couldn't have anything to do with the actual word. It couldn't be a form of the word. It had to be a hint. And eventually, the teams would go back and forth, and someone would win because they would get the password. Today, I want to play the game a little differently. I'm going to give a two-word phrase, and I want you to just blurt out the answer. You ready?
Sure.
Thanks. Practice makes...
Perfect.
Oh my God, a bunch of winners. Practice makes perfect. That's often the response that we would get.
Do you get something for winning?
Yes, you get an A for winning.
Yay.
For most of my life, I've engaged in practice of some kind. In music, I started on piano, then clarinet, then voice, violin, guitar, bass. And I can tell you that for all of these instruments, practice never led to perfection, to any sort of perfection. In sports, too, I started in baseball, soccer, racquetball, rugby, golf, and no doubt my practice never yielded anything even close to perfection. All you have to do is ask any of my opponents or my teammates, or my brothers for that matter. Later, or sometimes simultaneously, we practiced perhaps reading, writing, and arithmetic, and then even later forms of that like literary critique, theses, and physics and calculus. Perfection never resulted from any of my efforts. How about you? Our lives are filled with opportunities to practice. Tonight, we enter the Shabbat. Shabbat is a time, as you heard me say earlier, that's set aside for holiness. It compels us to engage in a spiritual practice. We focus our attention upon the fixed prayers, seeking to move beyond them, beyond any of the mundane stuff of our daily lives. Yet, this practice remains far from perfect. Sometimes our minds remain disconnected from the task. Sometimes we feel that our efforts will remain inadequate when measured against the awesome nature of the divine. Other times, we feel that our hearts are somewhat disconnected from their intended purpose. Despite all the doubt, and maybe even a little fear, we continue to exercise our thoughts, words, and actions in prayer. Each time, the result may be different. But if we keep at it, if we repeat each prayer enough, the challenge of prayer for each of us evolves. No longer do we find ourselves slowed down by our lack of familiarity of the text, because the text has become set in our minds and our mouths. Shema. Shema. Adonai. Adonai. As children or newly minted Jews, we learn this text through practice and slow repetition, that kind of practice. We affirm our relationship to God and God's oneness. Before we heard these words for the very first time, they sounded as foreign as any other Hebrew phrase. Now, all these years, all these repetitions later, they resonate in our hearts, our mouths, with an ease that can only come through multiple repetitions over time. We have the opportunity now to infuse these words with our heart's intention. For as we are taught, prayer without intention is like a body without a soul. Now, in this week's Torah portion, the following verses occur. Very troubling. Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, took their censers, put fire into them, and added incense. And they offered an unauthorized fire before God, which God had not instructed them to offer. Fire came forth from God, and it consumed them, so they died. It consumed them from within, so they died before God. Moses then said to Aaron, "This is what God spoke of when he said, 'Among those who approach me, I will show myself holy. In the sight of all the people, I will be honored.'" Every time I read this verse, I am troubled. I want there to be some answer, maybe even an apologetic. Something has to be changed, or maybe they meant this, or maybe they meant that. So there are a lot of things that our sages, they too were troubled. They've come up with some of the following. Perhaps Nadav and Avihu entered the Holy of Holies when they shouldn't have. Maybe they entered without wearing the proper vestments, the proper clothing. Maybe they took the fire from somewhere other than the altar. Or they didn't receive permission from Moses and Aaron. Yet another is offered. They were guilty of hubris. Some explain their punishment as not for this sin, but an earlier sin, when they ate and drank at the foot of Mount Sinai at the giving of the Torah. And lastly, not really lastly, but the last one I'll give you tonight, they approached God under the influence of alcohol. Perhaps for you, one of these resonates. Perhaps it works. For me, not so. For me, the story teaches something else. Despite the almost cruel and excessive punishment that God metes out, we know a couple of things for sure. The commandment to bring the sacrifice remains intact. And Aaron, the father, still held the responsibility of offering the sacrifices in the proper way. Since no other punishment of this kind, the kind that Nadav and Abihu suffered, is found in the text relating to the sacrifices, we can assume that following their death, everyone entrusted with the responsibility of entering the Holy of Holies to offer the sacrifices would forever know and be guided by the gravity of their task. They would arrive as prepared as possible, in consultation and with full permission of the highest priestly authority. They would be armed with the ability to fulfill their sacred task, wearing the prescribed attire, carrying the required vessels and ingredients. They would be forever humble, knowing full well the potential consequences of their actions. They would continue to make the prescribed offerings. Every time we enter this sanctuary, we do so with a bit more understanding and a bit more ability. Each time we study our sacred texts and allow them to spur us to action, we take one more step toward fulfilling our sacred covenant with God. With each prayer we master, possibilities of meaning emerge, and we become more open to multiple layers of intention. The fulfillment of our part of the covenant rests on our striving to learn in order to do for the sake of God. Earlier, I asked you to fill in the blank of the phrase, practice makes perfect. Now, for those who trained musically using the Suzuki method, you might remember the phrase differently, and that was, practice makes permanent. The failure of Nadav and Avihu is no different, really, than our own failures, as it teaches us to keep going. It is entirely possible that Nadav and Avihu had not yet acquired the knowledge and skill needed to bring the offering in the proper way. They suffered the ultimate punishment. Luckily, most of our failures don't end in death. We receive many opportunities to practice our offerings. While our practice may not make perfect or even permanent, our practice can make possible. May our practice make the offerings of our mouths and hands acceptable to our God. Ken Yehi Ratzon. Let it be God's will.